The weather had been strange for weeks leading up to the storm. Rain fell almost daily, heavier and more persistent than usual. The sky seemed perpetually gray, with clouds hanging low over the neighborhood like a thick blanket. At first, people didn't think much of it. After all, rain was normal during this time of year. But as the days turned into weeks, even the most optimistic residents began to feel uneasy. Sarah watched the lake closely. Every morning she'd step outside with a cup of coffee in hand and glance toward the water. It was rising, slowly but surely, and it made her stomach churn. She could see how close the waterline had crept to some of the houses near the shore. A few neighbors mentioned they'd noticed dampness in their basements or small puddles forming on their lawns after heavy downpours. Still, no one seemed overly concerned. They chalked it up to just a wet season and carried on with their lives. One evening, the HOA held yet another meeting. By now, Sarah was used to being met with skepticism whenever she brought up the dam. But this time she wasn't alone. A handful of other residents joined her, voicing their own concerns about the rising water levels. Mrs. Patel, who lived closest to the lake, described how waves were lapping dangerously close to her backyard deck. Mr. Carter, a retired firefighter, pointed out that the soil around the dam looked unstable and saturated. Even young families who usually stayed out of HOA politics spoke up, worried about the safety of their children. Mr. Thompson, however, remained unmoved. Sitting at the head of the table with his arms crossed, he listened impatiently as each person aired their fears. When it was finally his turn to speak, he sighed deeply and said, "Look, I understand everyone is nervous, but we can't jump to conclusions. This kind of thing happens every year. The dam has stood for decades without issue. There's no reason to believe it won't hold now." His words did little to reassure anyone. In fact, they only deepened the divide between those who trusted the HOA and those who thought they were gambling with people's lives. Voices grew louder as arguments erupted in the cramped community center where the meetings were held. Some accused the HOA of putting profits over safety, while others defended them, insisting there was no real proof of danger. Sarah tried to mediate, reminding everyone that the stakes were too high to ignore, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. As tensions simmered, the weather took a turn for the worse. What started as a light drizzle quickly escalated into a torrential downpour. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the darkened neighborhood in flashes of electric blue. Thunder rolled so loudly it rattled windows and shook walls. Residents huddled indoors, glued to their TVs and phones as local news stations warned of record-breaking rainfall expected to last for days. By the second night of the storm, the lake had swelled to unprecedented levels. Water spilled over parts of the shoreline, flooding walking paths and swallowing up docks. The sound of rushing water filled the air, constant and ominous. Sarah paced back and forth in her living room, unable to sleep. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. She kept picturing the cracks in the dam widening under the pressure of all that water. Early the next morning, she decided to check on the dam herself. Grabbing her raincoat and boots, she braved the storm and drove cautiously along flooded streets. Trees bent under the force of the wind, and streams of water poured from overflowing gutters. As she approached the dam, her heart sank. The sight was far worse than she'd imagined. The structure groaned under the weight of the swelling lake, its surface slick with rainwater. Large fissures snaked across its face, some wide enough to fit her hand inside. Water seeped through the cracks, spraying outward like tiny geysers. Panic gripped her chest. She pulled out her phone and called the HOA emergency hotline, her hands trembling as she dialed. No one answered. Frustrated, she tried calling 911 instead. "You need to send someone to the dam immediately," she urged the operator. "It's going to fail if you don't act fast." The dispatcher promised to relay her message but warned that resources were stretched thin due to the widespread flooding. Desperate, Sarah snapped photos and videos of the dam, posting them online in hopes of drawing attention to the crisis. Within minutes, her posts went viral among her neighbors, sparking panic throughout the community. Back at home, the mood was grim. People packed their cars with essentials, clothes, food, important documents, and prepared to evacuate. Children clung to their parents, confused and scared by the chaos unfolding around them. Elderly residents struggled to move quickly, relying on younger neighbors to help them pack and leave. The normally peaceful streets buzzed with activity as families fled to higher ground. Then came the moment no one wanted to face. Around midnight, an ear-splitting crack echoed through the valley, followed by a deafening roar. It was the sound of failure. The dam had given way. Millions of gallons of water surged forward, tearing through the landscape with unstoppable force. Homes closest to the lake bore the brunt of the destruction. Walls crumbled, roofs collapsed, and furniture floated away like toys in a bathtub. Sarah heard the commotion from her house, which sat farther uphill. She ran outside just in time to see a wall of water barreling toward the lower part of the neighborhood. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized how close the floodwaters were getting. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and flashlight and rushed to help her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who lived alone and might not have been able to evacuate in time. When Sarah reached Mrs. Jenkins' house, the water was already ankle-deep and rising rapidly. Together they scrambled onto the roof where they waited anxiously for rescue teams to arrive. From their vantage point, they could see the full extent of the devastation. Cars bobbed in the current like corks, and power lines snapped and sparked as they were dragged underwater. The once beautiful neighborhood now resembled a war zone. As dawn broke, the rain finally began to ease. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, survivors gathered on higher ground, sharing stories of escape and loss. Some hugged each other tightly, grateful to be alive. Others stared blankly at the wreckage, unable to process what had happened. One thing was clear: life in the neighborhood would never be the same again. For Sarah, the guilt weighed heavily. She had done everything she could to warn people, but it hadn't been enough. Now, as she looked out over the ruins of her community, she vowed to fight for accountability, not just for herself, but for everyone who had lost so much because of negligence. In a quiet little neighborhood nestled near a peaceful lake, life seemed perfect. The houses were neat and tidy, the lawns were always trimmed just right, and everyone took pride in keeping their community looking beautiful. At the heart of this suburban paradise was the Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. The HOA had one main job: to make sure everything in the neighborhood looked picture perfect. They had rules about how tall your grass could grow, what color you could paint, your front door, and even where you could park your car. To most people, these rules felt harmless enough, just part of living in such a nice place. But there was one thing the HOA didn't like talking about: the old dam that sat at the edge of the lake. It wasn't exactly something residents thought about every day. After all, it had been there for decades, quietly doing its job of holding back water so the lake stayed at a safe level. But if anyone stopped to really look at it, they'd notice something unsettling. The dam was old, cracked, and showing signs of wear and tear. One person who couldn't ignore it was Sarah Miller. Sarah wasn't just any resident. She worked as an environmental engineer during the week, designing systems to manage water and prevent disasters. Her job gave her a keen eye for spotting problems, and when she saw the state of the dam, alarm bells went off in her head. She knew that dams needed regular maintenance to stay strong, especially since they held back millions of gallons of water. If something went wrong with this dam, the consequences could be catastrophic. Sarah tried to bring up her concerns at the monthly HOA meetings. "I've noticed some cracks forming along the base of the dam," she said during one meeting, standing up nervously while other residents sipped coffee and scrolled through their phones. "We should consider having it inspected by professionals before the rainy season starts." The room fell silent for a moment. Then, Mr. Thompson, the president of the HOA, cleared his throat. He was a no-nonsense man in his late 50s with a booming voice and a firm belief that he knew best. "Sarah, thank you for bringing this to our attention," he began, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But let me assure you, we've been monitoring the dam for years and it's perfectly fine. These kinds of things happen naturally over time." Sarah wasn't satisfied. With respect, Mr. Thompson, I deal with structures like this every day. Cracks aren't normal. They're warning signs. We can't afford to wait until it's too late. Her words caused a stir among the attendees. Some nodded in agreement, while others rolled their eyes. One woman whispered loudly to her neighbor, "Here we go again with Sarah's doom and gloom predictions." Another muttered, "She's probably just trying to get more work for herself." Despite the pushback, Sarah refused to give up. Over the next few weeks, she spent countless hours researching the dam's history, gathering data, and creating detailed reports. She found out that the dam hadn't undergone any significant repairs in over 30 years. She also discovered that similar dams in nearby areas had failed after being neglected for too long. Armed with this information, she returned to the HOA with charts, graphs, and photos to prove her point. "I'm not saying the dam will collapse tomorrow," she explained patiently during another tense meeting. "But if we don't address these issues now, we're putting ourselves at risk. Heavy rains are becoming more common, and when they hit, the dam might not hold." This time, however, the response was even colder. Mr. Thompson cut her off mid-sentence. "Sarah, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let's be realistic here. Fixing the dam would cost tens of thousands of dollars, money we simply don't have. Besides, our property values depend on keeping costs low. No one wants to see their dues skyrocket because of unnecessary repairs." The crowd murmured in agreement. Many residents liked the idea of keeping their HOA fees affordable, even if it meant ignoring potential risks. Others didn't want to believe that anything bad could happen to their cozy neighborhood. After all, nothing serious had ever gone wrong before. Why start worrying now? Frustrated but determined, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She started knocking on doors, talking to her neighbors face to face. She showed them pictures of the cracks and explained what could happen if the dam failed. Some listened intently, nodding along as she spoke. Others politely thanked her, but shrugged off her warnings. "It'll be fine," they'd say. The HOA wouldn't let anything dangerous happen. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to feel like she was fighting a losing battle. The HOA continued to brush off her concerns, opting instead to focus on trivial matters like holiday decorations and mailbox colors. Meanwhile, the weather started shifting. Dark clouds gathered overhead more frequently, and rain showers became longer and heavier. Meteorologists on the news warned of an unusually wet season ahead, but still, no action was taken. Sarah often found herself staring out her window at the lake, watching the water rise inch by inch. Each ripple reminded her of the ticking clock she felt counting down. She wondered how much longer it would take for someone, anyone, to realize the danger lurking beneath the surface. Little did she know, the storm of the century was already brewing, ready to unleash its fury on the unsuspecting neighborhood. And when it finally arrived, the consequences would be far worse than anyone imagined. The days following the flood were a blur of activity and emotion. The initial shock of the disaster began to wear off, replaced by the harsh realities of survival and recovery. As the waters receded, they left behind a grim landscape. Piles of mud-caked debris, shattered homes, and streets that looked more like war zones than suburban neighborhoods. For many residents, returning to their properties was both heartbreaking and surreal. What had once been cozy living rooms now lay exposed to the elements, with furniture overturned and walls reduced to splinters. Sarah walked through the wreckage alongside her neighbors, her heart heavy as she surveyed the damage. Each step felt like walking through a graveyard of memories. She passed Mrs. Patel's house, or what was left of it, and saw the woman standing in silence, staring at the empty space where her kitchen used to be. Nearby, Mr. Carter was knee-deep in muck, trying to salvage tools from his collapsed garage. His hands were raw and blistered, but he didn't stop working. "Gotta keep moving," he muttered when Sarah offered him water. "If I stop, I'll just think about everything we've lost." As the cleanup efforts continued, so did the finger-pointing. Tempers flared during impromptu meetings held on higher ground, where survivors gathered to discuss next steps. Some demanded answers from the HOA, while others argued over who should take responsibility for rebuilding. At one such meeting, tensions boiled over when Greg, a vocal defender of the HOA, tried to downplay the organization's role in the tragedy. "We can't blame them for an act of nature," he insisted, his face red with frustration. His words ignited a firestorm of responses. "An act of nature?" snapped a young mother named Lisa, holding her toddler close. "This wasn't just, Rain, that dam broke because no one fixed it. We trusted the HOA to protect us and they failed." The argument escalated quickly, with voices rising and accusations flying. Sarah stepped forward, raising her hands to calm the crowd. "Fighting isn't going to help anyone," she said firmly. "What's done is done. Right now, we need to focus on holding people accountable, not just the HOA, but everyone involved. This includes local officials who let this happen." Her words struck a chord, and slowly, the anger turned into determination. Residents decided to pool their resources and file a class action lawsuit against the HOA, accusing its leadership of negligence. Lawyers arrived in droves, offering pro bono services to those affected. Evidence poured in: Sarah's detailed reports, photos of the cracked dam, emails showing how warnings had been ignored, and testimonies from experts who confirmed that proper maintenance could have prevented the collapse. At the center of the legal battle stood Sarah herself. Her expertise made her a key witness, and she spent hours preparing statements, attending depositions, and answering questions from attorneys. It wasn't easy. Reliving the events leading up to the disaster brought back waves of guilt and frustration, but she knew it was necessary. "I'm not doing this for revenge," she told a reporter during an interview. "I'm doing it because no one else should have to go through what we've gone through. If we don't learn from this, it'll happen again somewhere else." The media coverage only intensified public outrage. News outlets aired segments highlighting the HOA's refusal to act despite clear warnings. Social media campaigns gained momentum, with hashtags like "Justice for the Neighborhood" trending nationwide. People from across the country sent messages of support, donations, and even volunteers to assist with cleanup efforts. Celebrities weighed in, calling for stricter regulations on infrastructure oversight. The story became a symbol of bureaucratic failure, sparking debates about accountability and community safety. Meanwhile, cracks began to form within the HOA itself. Board members pointed fingers at each other, each trying to distance themselves from blame. Mr. Thompson, the president, resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. Rumors swirled that he planned to leave town altogether to avoid facing consequences. Other board members followed suit, leaving the organization in disarray. Without leadership, the HOA effectively dissolved, unable to manage the mounting pressure from lawsuits and public scrutiny. Local government officials scrambled to respond to the crisis. City council meetings drew large crowds, with angry residents demanding answers and action. Engineers were dispatched to assess the remaining structures near the lake, including roads and bridges weakened by the flood. Plans were drawn up for a new dam, one designed to modern standards and capable of withstanding extreme weather conditions. Funding, however, remained a sticking point. Taxpayer dollars would be needed to cover the costs, which sparked yet another round of heated discussions. Despite the chaos, some positive changes emerged. The tragedy forced residents to confront long-standing divisions within the community. Neighbors who had barely spoken before found themselves working side by side, sharing meals and offering emotional support. Friendships blossomed out of shared hardship, creating bonds stronger than ever before. Even those who had disagreed vehemently during earlier arguments eventually found common ground, united by their determination to rebuild. One particularly poignant moment came when a group of teenagers organized a memorial service for the neighborhood. They set up a display of photographs and mementos salvaged from the floodwaters, inviting everyone to share stories of what they lost and what they hoped to regain. Sarah attended the event, moved to tears as she listened to heartfelt speeches and watched candles being lit in memory of happier times. For the first time since the disaster, she felt a glimmer of hope. As weeks turned into months, the legal proceedings dragged on. Depositions stretched into days and court hearings became routine. While exhausting, the process kept the issue in the public eye, ensuring that accountability remained a priority. Eventually, several former HOA board members faced criminal charges for negligence, though convictions were far from guaranteed. Regardless, the case served as a wake-up call for communities everywhere, prompting reviews of aging infrastructure and renewed calls for transparency and governance. Through it all, Sarah emerged as a reluctant hero. Her persistence and courage inspired others to speak out against complacency, whether in their own neighborhoods or on larger stages. She traveled to nearby towns to share her story, urging residents to demand better oversight of critical systems like dams, levees, and drainage networks. Her advocacy earned her recognition from environmental groups and policymakers, further amplifying her message. By the end of the year, the neighborhood bore little resemblance to its former self. New foundations rose from the ruins, and fresh coats of paint brightened what remained of old structures. Trees planted along the shoreline symbolized resilience and renewal. Though scars lingered, both visible and invisible, the community had begun to heal. For Sarah, the journey wasn't over. She still carried the weight of what had happened, knowing that no amount of rebuilding could erase the pain. But she also recognized the power of collective action. Together, her neighbors had transformed tragedy into a catalyst for change, and as she stood by the edge of the newly constructed dam, watching sunlight glint off the calm surface of the lake, she allowed herself a small smile. The road ahead would be challenging, but they had proven that even in the face of devastation, hope could endure. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the lingering storm clouds, the true scale of the devastation began to emerge. The floodwaters had transformed the once idyllic neighborhood into a scene straight out of a disaster movie. Streets that were once lined with manicured lawns and charming homes now resembled muddy rivers, carrying debris from shattered lives. Furniture, toys, photographs, and personal belongings, all swept away by the relentless surge. Sarah stood on the roof of Mrs. Jenkins's house, her body shivering not just from the cold but also from exhaustion and shock. She clutched her phone tightly in her hand, its battery dangerously low after hours of calls and texts. Rescue teams had finally arrived, navigating the flooded streets in boats, their faces grim as they assessed the damage. One by one, stranded residents were ferried to safety, including Sarah and Mrs. Jenkins, who was wrapped in a blanket borrowed from a neighbor's emergency kit. When they reached higher ground, the sight was overwhelming. Dozens of families huddled together under makeshift shelters set up by volunteers and local authorities. Some sat silently, staring off into the distance, while others cried openly, clinging to loved ones. Children wandered aimlessly, confused and frightened, their usual playgrounds now submerged beneath murky water. It was a surreal moment, a community brought to its knees by forces beyond their control. The stories shared among survivors painted a harrowing picture of the night's events. Mr. Carter, the retired firefighter, recounted how he barely managed to escape his home before it collapsed under the weight of the floodwaters. He described watching in horror as his prized toolshed floated past him like driftwood. Mrs. Patel spoke tearfully about losing family heirlooms passed down for generations, priceless artifacts now buried somewhere deep underwater. Even those whose homes remained standing felt the sting of loss. Many had no electricity or running water, rendering their houses uninhabitable. Amidst the chaos, tensions flared over what had happened and why. Whispers turned into heated arguments as people vented their anger at the HOA. "If they'd listened to Sarah months ago, none of this would have happened," shouted one man, his voice cracking with emotion. His words resonated with others, sparking murmurs of agreement. Another woman chimed in. They cared more about saving money than saving lives. Not everyone blamed the HOA outright. A few residents defended the organization, insisting that hindsight made everything seem clearer. No one could have predicted this, argued a middle-aged man named Greg, though his tone lacked conviction. Others simply stayed silent, too traumatized to engage in debates about responsibility. Still, the majority couldn't ignore the glaring truth. Warnings had been ignored, risks dismissed, and now the consequences were painfully evident. For Sarah, Hearing these conversations stirred a mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt vindicated, her worst fears realized, but on the other, she was consumed by guilt. She replayed every interaction she'd had with the HOA in her mind, wondering if there was something else she could have done to make them listen. Had she been louder, more persuasive, less confrontational? These questions haunted her as she moved among the crowd, offering comfort where she could. Local officials soon arrived to assess the situation, accompanied by news crews eager to document the unfolding tragedy. Reporters interviewed distraught residents, capturing raw footage of destroyed homes and flooded streets. When a microphone was thrust toward Sarah, she hesitated before speaking. Taking a deep breath, she recounted her repeated attempts to warn the HOA about the dam's condition. Her calm yet passionate delivery struck a chord with listeners, both within the community and beyond. By midday, social media buzzed with outrage over the HOA's negligence. Photos and videos taken during the disaster spread rapidly, accompanied by hashtags like "Listen to Experts" and "HOA Negligence." People from neighboring towns expressed sympathy and offered support, while critics lambasted the HOA for prioritizing aesthetics over safety. Calls for accountability grew louder, with some demanding criminal charges against the board members. Meanwhile, practical challenges mounted. With so many displaced families, finding temporary housing became a top priority. Local churches and community centers opened their doors to shelter survivors, while volunteers distributed food, water, and blankets. Insurance adjusters flocked to the area, promising to help homeowners recover financially. But the process proved complicated. Many policies excluded coverage for damages caused by natural disasters exacerbated by human error, leaving countless families unsure of how to rebuild. Despite the logistical hurdles, moments of hope emerged amid the despair. Neighbors came together in ways they never had before, forming bonds forged in adversity. Strangers became friends as they shared meals, swapped stories, and lent each other strength. Sarah noticed this shift firsthand when a group of teenagers organized a cleanup effort, wading through knee-deep mud to salvage whatever they could from ruined homes. Their determination inspired others to pitch in, creating a sense of unity that hadn't existed prior to the flood. As evening approached, the rain returned, lighter this time, but still unwelcome. Exhausted survivors huddled closer under tarps and tents, grateful for small mercies like dry socks and warm coffee. Sarah found herself sitting beside Mrs. Jenkins, who clasped her hand tightly. "Thank you," the older woman whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Sarah smiled weakly, though tears welled up in her eyes. "We'll get through this," she replied softly. "Together." Though the immediate danger had passed, the road ahead promised to be long and difficult. Homes needed rebuilding, lives needed healing, and trust needed restoring. But even in the darkest moments, resilience shone through. The flood may have destroyed much of what the neighborhood held dear, but it also revealed the strength and compassion hidden within its people. And as Sarah looked around at the faces of her neighbors, tired, broken, yet determined, she knew that somehow they would rise again. Months turned into years, and the neighborhood slowly began to resemble its former self. But it was a different place now. The scars of the flood remained etched not just in the landscape, but also in the hearts of those who had lived through it. New homes stood where old ones had crumbled, their designs simpler yet sturdier, built with an eye toward resilience rather than perfection. The streets were quieter, the air tinged with both sadness and determination. Life had changed forever, but the community had found ways to move forward. The new dam, a towering structure of reinforced concrete and steel, loomed over the lake like a silent guardian. It was designed using state-of-the-art technology, capable of withstanding even the most severe storms. Engineers conducted regular inspections, ensuring that maintenance schedules were strictly followed. Residents could now check real-time water levels online, thanks to sensors installed along the shoreline. Transparency became the cornerstone of the rebuilding process, replacing the secrecy and complacency that had once defined the HOA. In place of the defunct HOA, a new organization emerged, the Community Oversight Council, COC. Unlike its predecessor, the COC prioritized practicality over aesthetics. Its members included residents from all walks of life, teachers, engineers, retirees, and young families, each bringing unique perspectives to decision-making. Monthly meetings were open to everyone, fostering a sense of inclusion that had been sorely lacking before. Decisions weren't made behind closed doors anymore. Instead, they were discussed openly, with input from experts and ordinary citizens alike. Sarah played a pivotal role in shaping this new era. Though she initially hesitated to take on a leadership position, her neighbors insisted, citing her unwavering dedication during the darkest days. As chairperson of the COC's Infrastructure Committee, she worked tirelessly to ensure that lessons learned from the tragedy were never forgotten. She pushed for stricter regulations, emergency preparedness drills, and educational programs about disaster risk reduction. Her advocacy extended beyond the neighborhood, as she spoke at conferences and collaborated with policymakers to improve safety standards nationwide. Despite these efforts, healing wasn't easy. The legal battles dragged on for years, leaving many emotionally drained. Some former HOA board members received fines and probation, while others avoided punishment altogether due to lack of evidence. For survivors, justice felt incomplete, a bittersweet reminder that accountability often fell short in the face of systemic failures. Still, the lawsuits served a greater purpose. They forced communities across the country to reevaluate their own vulnerabilities. Countless towns and cities reviewed aging dams, levees, and drainage systems, implementing upgrades to prevent similar disasters. Within the neighborhood itself, relationships remained complicated. While some friendships grew stronger through shared hardship, others fractured under the weight of blame and resentment. Longtime neighbors stopped speaking after heated arguments over responsibility and compensation. Families who had lost everything struggled to rebuild trust, questioning whether they truly belonged in a place that held so many painful memories. Yet amidst the fractures, there were glimmers of hope. Newcomers arrived, drawn by affordable housing and the promise of a fresh start. They brought energy and optimism, helping to bridge divides and create a more inclusive community. One such newcomer was Mia, a single mother with 2 young children. She moved into a modest home near the lake, unaware of its troubled history, until her neighbors filled her in. At first, she worried about raising her kids in a place marked by tragedy. But as she attended COC meetings and volunteered at local events, she realized something remarkable. The neighborhood was determined to rise above its past. Inspired by their resilience, Mia joined the Education Committee, organizing workshops for children on environmental awareness and emergency preparedness. Her enthusiasm reignited a spark in longtime residents, reminding them why they had fought so hard to rebuild. As time passed, small victories added up. A community garden sprouted near the park, tended by volunteers who planted flowers and vegetables side by side. A mural depicting the flood and the strength it took to overcome it covered the wall of the recreation center. Annual festivals returned, celebrating not just survival, but renewal. One event, dubbed Resilience Day, featured speeches, music, and activities aimed at honoring the past while looking toward the future. Sarah often spoke at these gatherings, sharing stories of loss and hope in equal measure. Standing on the rebuilt dam one crisp autumn morning, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come. The lake shimmered below, its surface calm and inviting. Birds chirped in the trees lining the shore, and laughter echoed from a group of children playing nearby. It was hard to imagine that this serene spot had once been ground zero for devastation. Yet Sarah knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving. Beneath the beauty lay reminders of what had been lost and what had been gained. She thought about the people who had shaped her journey. Mrs. Jenkins, whose quiet gratitude had taught her the value of compassion. Mr. Carter, whose relentless work ethic inspired her to keep pushing forward. Lisa, whose fiery determination reminded her that anger could fuel change. These connections, forged in the crucible of crisis, had become the foundation of her new life. Looking out over the water, Sarah allowed herself a moment of peace. The fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead, but she felt confident in their ability to face them together. The neighborhood had transformed not just physically but emotionally, shedding its illusions of invincibility and embracing vulnerability as a source of strength. They had learned that beauty wasn't about perfection, it was about resilience, unity, and the courage to rebuild. As she walked back toward her home, Sarah smiled at a neighbor passing by, a man she barely recognized before the flood, but now considered a friend. He waved warmly, his arms laden with groceries. In that simple exchange, she saw proof of what they had achieved. A community reborn, stronger and wiser than before. And though the memory of the flood would always linger, it no longer defined them. Instead, it served as a testament to their ability to endure, adapt, and thrive, even when faced with the unimaginable.